So, this episode is going to talk more so about common tools and softwares that you might actually use on a daily basis and their accessibility. Previously, we talked more so about screen readers specifically. So, if you want to hear more about those, then go back to episode 29. And it is good to be back after a couple weeks break, and I'm excited to talk more about this topic, as it's honestly been really interesting, even for me, learning about maybe certain software that I personally don't use as much, even different screen readers that have been available on other platforms. So yeah, let's get right into it. So our first section here is going to discuss, I suppose, the best way to describe them are like office suites or word processors. Not specifically just word processors, but those kinds of things. So the first one that might come to mind there is Microsoft Office, right? So that includes things like obviously Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, Microsoft PowerPoint, etc. There's actually quite a few tools as part of the Microsoft Office suite, but those are the kind of most popular ones. So that one has been around for a long time at this point and is used by a lot of people. Just like some of the ones that we'll talk about, but some of them are obviously less common. But Microsoft Office is obviously huge, and if you haven't heard of Microsoft Office, then I'm not sure what to tell you. Um, Microsoft Word itself provides really good support for screen readers. As they let you add things like headings, landmarks, alt text for images, which also make things a lot easier for screen readers in the first place. Now, when I was actually learning how to use a computer, as part of that class, it was basically dedicated to learning about Microsoft Word. And Microsoft Word is very accessible. I've used it extensively. I actually don't use it anymore, but that's more so just because we don't have Microsoft Office. But it's really good. It has a lot of keyboard shortcuts even for screen readers. And it honestly makes it really easy to kind of add different formatting to a document and stuff, even if you can't see, like adding borders to things, making things into headings, and making them like bold, italic. That's all very easy within Microsoft Word for a screen reader user. For example, you press Control and B to make text bold. Or if you want to get to the menu where you can change like the font size and things like that, you can press Control Shift and P. If you want to make something a heading, I think you press like Alt and H, then you press L and then S or something like that. So there's a lot of keyboard shortcuts and stuff built into Microsoft Word that make it really easy for somebody to kind of edit a document or even just read a document, to be honest, when they are using a screen reader. So, PowerPoint. Now, in reality, technically, support for PowerPoint for screen readers is very good. And they do have built-in tools for accessibility checking, but honestly, no matter what the software, using PowerPoints is terrible with a screen reader, and I avoid it at all costs. It is very difficult to navigate PowerPoints using a screen reader, and you have to use like keyboard shortcuts that you wouldn't use anywhere else in order to navigate. You can't just use the arrow keys or the tab keys like you would on a website or even in Microsoft Word. So honestly, although technically PowerPoint is accessible, it could honestly be a lot better, and I avoid it at all costs. I will only read a PowerPoint if that is the only thing that I can do. And even then, you can just export it into a text file, which is what I'll often do because I hate using Microsoft PowerPoint. And again, that applies to pretty much all PowerPoint software. It's not just Microsoft PowerPoint, but just obviously that's one of the more popular ones. So technically, it does have great screen reader support, but most people who use screen readers are not going to want to use it. And there are exceptions to that, but in general, we try and avoid it. So now Microsoft Office does integrate really well with screen readers, even tools like Excel. are pretty accessible, to be quite honest with you. Um, so honestly, Microsoft Office super accessible, integrates really well with screen readers, and pretty much every essential feature that you need is available. Like if you wanted to make a presentation in Microsoft PowerPoint with a screen reader, it is perfectly doable. Is it the nicest thing in the world? No. But can you do it? Yeah, you definitely can. So, speaking of Excel, that is one of the actual disadvantages of Microsoft Office because some of the more advanced features, so for example, like macros, data validation, and pivot tables, can be difficult for screen readers to interpret properly. Obviously, they can just be quite complex, and it can honestly just be a bit difficult to navigate around even some of those more advanced things, and some of the more advanced menus. So that is more so, I don't want to say more, not really to do with Excel, but more so data itself. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to format in a good accessible way, but it can be a bit of a challenge, especially with Excel, with some of those more advanced things. Office web apps, however, do definitely have inconsistent desktop support for accessibility compared to the actual desktop apps. So, if given the choice, I will always use the desktop version of Microsoft Office, whether it be Word or Excel or PowerPoint, over the web version because it's just not as good. It's just not as accessible. And I would literally never use Office 365, which is, I believe, what the online version is called. So definitely avoid that when possible if you're using a screen reader and try and use the actual dedicated apps. Now, obviously, Microsoft Office does have a bit of a learning curve, especially like I mentioned for people using screen readers, um, because things like PowerPoint and things do require you to learn dedicated keyboard shortcuts. So that definitely can be a bit of a disadvantage when using Microsoft Office. So um, there have been a lot of improvements in Microsoft Office over the years, even in Excel, which, as I said, does have a few accessibility issues in PowerPoint. It just impacts more so user satisfaction than anything else. I said I can use all the tools in Microsoft Office, but I'm not always happy to use them. I said for me personally, especially PowerPoint. Now, next on the list is Google Workspace. And yet again, you've probably heard of this before if you've heard of Google Docs, Google Sheets, or Google Slides. These are essentially Microsoft alternatives here from Google. So Google Docs is like Microsoft Word, Google Sheets is like Excel, and Google Slides is like Microsoft PowerPoint. Now, do keep in mind all of these are web-based as opposed to desktop apps. So Google Docs, although it is a website essentially or a web app, it is actually pretty accessible. Now, there are some problems which we'll get into later. However, it does have a lot of sort of accessibility features going for it that Word actually doesn't necessarily. So it is compatible with a lot of different accessibility tools, and also even real-time editing is actually accessible, which in Microsoft Word it is definitely not. At least when I last used it. But Google Docs, really accessible and actually very, very good. So, Google Sheets also offers good basic accessibility, and note the word basic accessibility there because it is fine for navigating around the cells and things like that. But once you kind of get beyond that and actually creating and editing the sheets, it is not great, to say the least, at least in my opinion. Google Slides actually is pretty accessible. It also has the ability to add alt text images and has its own keyboard shortcuts as well. Again, not perfect. PowerPoints are never great, but honestly, pretty good in general. Now, Google Sheets, for example, can have some Google Sheets can have some problems with real-time updates. Um, Now that's not necessarily just accessibility; that's just in general. But definitely, even just communicating that to screen readers on Google Sheets could be a bit better. Advanced formatting and things like that in Google Docs and Sheets definitely does cause issues for navigation. So there are some third-party add-ons and things like that for Google Sheets and Docs um, that are definitely not accessible. So that is a pretty big problem. So with around a 60% satisfaction reported among screen reader users for Google Docs, it has definitely gotten better, but still faces challenges, especially in more complicated sort of content. And the problem for me with Google Workspace, which is actually what I use, even the notes for this episode were actually in Google Docs right now, is it doesn't use the standard keyboard shortcuts. You have to learn them. And honestly, they aren't the best. Even getting to menus and stuff like that in Google Docs is much harder than in Microsoft Word. I personally really like it though, because you can use Google Docs on any device without installing anything, and it is pretty accessible. And you can definitely use it if you have a screen reader. I've actually started using another thing. We haven't mentioned it in this episode, but I've been trying out LibreOffice, which is an open source software. So it's not made by Google or Microsoft, and you can actually view the code for it, like the source code. And you can actually add features and things like that to it as well if you want. But that is definitely an alternative, but that has its own accessibility problems, and because it's not as widely used, it's a little bit harder to get information like this on it. But definitely an alternative if you're interested in open source software for sure. We're next going to touch quickly on mobile screen readers because we talked about desktop ones last time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about about smartphone accessibility, and we can't really talk about that without talking about screen readers. So on iOS, again, we have VoiceOver, same name. I don't like that. It's a little bit confusing, but I kind of like it because it lets you know what it is. So whether you're on macOS or iOS, you know what VoiceOver is, which is a good thing, but as far as I'm aware, they're not the same screen reader technically because they are on different operating systems. Now, I will say this, VoiceOver is obviously deeply integrated into iOS, so it provides a really good experience, and will cover pretty much any of your needs on iOS. So VoiceOver also gets a lot of updates from Apple, and they make sure that any features that they're adding into iOS are accessible and work with VoiceOver. So there's also like a lot of different navigation features with VoiceOver. So I think it's VoiceOver Router, I believe is the name of the exact feature. So basically what it does is it allows you access to different types of information when you are navigating around on iOS, so that you can navigate more efficiently. Like you don't have to just navigate from clickable item to clickable item. Essentially, you can navigate to the next type of something, for example. So, as always with Apple, customization is limited to say the least, and you definitely won't get as many options, or there definitely aren't as many ways to change things as there are on other platforms like Android. Obviously, third-party compatibility here. Apps may not be optimized to work with VoiceOver, and that can cause problems, but this is less of a problem on iOS than it is on Android, actually. Obviously, if you want to use VoiceOver, you have to buy an Apple device, and they are just more expensive, and that is just a fact. You can go out right now and buy a new Android phone for €100 if you want. Will it be very good? Maybe not, but you can do it. You can go out and buy that, and you can use TalkBack, and it's fine. but you cannot really go out and buy an iPhone for €100. If you do, it will probably be very, very old. Because iPhones, they do reduce in cost, but they actually keep their value relatively well. So, 87% of blind users supposedly prefer iOS because of its accessibility. So this does show that Apple does have good user satisfaction there, and a preference for Apple's ecosystem with that. Now, just to to let you know, I'm actually an Android user. I don't use iOS. So yeah, that is a very interesting statistic to me that Apple has an 87% sort of preference there. But yeah, so that is Apple and their sort of screen reader that is available on iOS. Obviously, next up is Android. So Android has TalkBack specifically, and that has quite a few strengths. So TalkBack offers more customizability than VoiceOver does. So you can actually customize the gestures and can change a lot more of the settings to sort of suit your preference as opposed to VoiceOver. So you can really customize TalkBack to function how you want it to function, which is honestly really nice, especially for me. I don't want to say a bit particular about how I like my screen reader to work, but I am. So it's nice to be able to have that set up exactly how I want. So obviously it's available on a wide variety of devices. So if you buy a Samsung phone, it has TalkBack. Now actually that's technically different than Google's version of TalkBack, but we're not going to get into that today. If you buy a Google Pixel, it will have TalkBack. If you buy a phone from OnePlus, it will have TalkBack. If you buy one from Xiaomi or Huawei, it will have TalkBack. They all have TalkBack. And there are many different manufacturers out there and many different price points. So if you want to buy an expensive phone for €1,000 from Samsung, go ahead and you'll get TalkBack. If you don't want to spend that much money on a phone, then you can choose to buy from a different manufacturer or even from Samsung because they have cheaper phones like their A and J series. You can do that. And that way you can still get a phone with a screen reader at a much more reasonable price. So obviously, if you are using Google's ecosystem, this integrates very well with Google's apps. So if you are using Gmail, Google Docs, anything like that, you will have a pretty good experience on mobile, and it works pretty well with TalkBack. Now, there obviously are some some disadvantages as well here to TalkBack, and that's the consistency, because the performance can vary wildly between different Android devices and versions, which can really impact your kind of experience. So for example, if you have a Samsung phone and a Google phone, it is quite likely that you'll have a different experience. Or if you change your version of Android, it's quite likely that TalkBack will be different. Maybe better, maybe worse. I've had both happen to me, actually. I actually recently switched to, I have a Google Pixel now, and that has been really great in terms of TalkBack, and they add a lot of new features, usually, with software updates, but again, it depends on your manufacturer and your Android version as well. Just like with iOS as well, this can vary wildly depending on the app that you're using, and some apps don't work at all. I can't really speak too much to that on iOS due to my limited experience with it, but I can tell you that a lot of apps on Android are not accessible. It is pretty often that you will come across things like unlabeled buttons and things like that in really popular apps, even like WhatsApp. Actually, recently, if you use WhatsApp, you know that if you long press on a message, it will give you the option to react to it, and then at the top, it will have buttons for like copying, forwarding, replying, etc. So I actually wasn't able to access that top kind of toolbar area for, I'd say, about a month. They updated WhatsApp, it broke the accessibility of that top area. All I could do is react to a message. They did fix it, but for a brief time there, it was not accessible. And that happens actually pretty often. Now, The thing about TalkBack is if you're using it for the first time and you go look at the settings, it can be quite overwhelming because there are a lot of options there. So it is important to kind of keep that in mind. That maybe if you're not as good with technology, then TalkBack might be a little bit more kind of overwhelming, especially if you've never used a screen reader before. Now, iOS is generally preferred for people using screen readers. However, Android has a lot more flexibility and customization. So if you have any specific adjustments you would like to make, then it is quite likely that TalkBack will be your kind of best bet there. Now, the other thing about Android is that there are actually other screen readers available that aren't made by Google. They're not necessarily built into Android, but you can actually download and use other screen readers. And again, I'm not going to get into that in this episode, but I believe it's called Jishuo. I believe it was actually originally created as a Chinese screen reader, but it is now branched out and encompasses many, many languages and is an alternative to TalkBack. I personally don't use it, but I've seen a lot of people who say that it is a lot better than TalkBack, and that is what they use instead of TalkBack. So it's also worth keeping that in mind. You could technically build your own screen reader for Android and use it, whereas I don't believe you have that option on iOS. So that's also worth keeping in mind as well. So yeah, that is Android and TalkBack specifically, but again, there are also other alternatives out there as well. Another very common thing that you might encounter nowadays are smart home devices. So the first one here that we're going to talk about is Amazon Echo, or Alexa, as you will often hear it called. Now, keep in mind, it's not just available in the Amazon Echo devices, but that's where you may know it from. So Alexa is actually very user-friendly in terms of the sort of setup process, and also the simple voice commands are also really good, especially for blind users. There's no real visual part to the setup. The most you'll have to do is go to the Amazon app. It also works with a broad range of smart home devices and services, so it means that if you are interested in something like home automation, then you can probably achieve that even if you are blind. Amazon's also constantly updating Alexa with new features and improvements based on user feedback. So just to mention another kind of advantage here is Alexa has skills, and there are actually skills from organizations for the blind, such as I think they recently renamed to Vision Ireland. They used to be called the NCBI, and they actually have an Alexa skill that will let you access audiobooks for free. And there are a lot of other Alexa skills out there for specifically blind people, which is something unique to Alexa, these sort of Alexa skills. So if you're interested in, smart assistants or anything to do with smart homes, then Alexa is definitely worth looking into if you are interested in sort of accessibility focused things like that. So some of the weaknesses here are the device settings themselves for managing accessibility are honestly pretty limited, so that can pose definitely some challenges for blind users. And as I mentioned earlier, there are third-party skills available, but not all of them are accessible or will work well for somebody who actually is blind. Because, for example, they may actually not have any voice feedback associated with the skills. So that can be a bit of a problem as well. So that is definitely worth keeping in mind. So that is it for Amazon's kind of offering. And Amazon is pretty good in terms of their accessibility. And I said, especially if you're interested in the Alexa skills, which can be really useful for people who can't see. It can be really, really useful. Obviously, as I said, Alexa is available in other devices that are not made by Amazon. You'll see that a lot of the time if you look on Amazon, actually, if you look at a smart speaker, it'll say like Alexa certified, for example, or Alexa enabled, actually, I think might be what it says. and that will mean that that actually has Alexa, or it might say Alexa built in as well. Actually, it depends. But yeah, so there's a lot of devices out there with Alexa in them, even if you don't specifically want an Amazon device. So the next kind of option there, if you're not interested specifically in Alexa, is Google Assistant slash Nest. Now, the branding there can be a little bit confusing because sometimes it will just be a Google device, sometimes it will be Google Nest, and sometimes it will just be Nest, but they are all part of the same ecosystem now. And Google Nest is essentially just the new version of Nest. So just to make that very clear. So this is the ecosystem that I personally use, but that does not necessarily mean that it's better than Alexa, it's just what I use. So Google Assistant has very strong voice control capabilities, and it can really easily manage your smart home devices and perform tasks through your voice commands. It also works really well with Google services, so for example, YouTube, YouTube Music, etc., anything like that, and a range of other compatible smart home devices. You can see a full list of that on Google's website, or if you look in the Google Home app, if you go to add a new device, and then there's an option there to look at all the third-party options, and you'll see the amount of devices and brands that are available there that can work with your Google Nest and will work with Google Assistant. It's actually a huge amount. So there is some level of customization available there based on user preferences, and this will be probably increasing as they move towards using AI and integrating Google Gemini more with their Google Nest products, which they are starting to do actually right now. So that is worth keeping in mind. But Google do offer at least some customization for your smart home devices, but it isn't necessarily more or less than Alexa. So some of the problems with Google can be the setup complexity. Sometimes it can be a bit more complicated or less intuitive than Alexa, and I have had this problem, especially with some third-party devices. Setting them up can honestly be a bit of a pain and can maybe take quite a while, and you might just have to try and do it 2 or 3 times as opposed to just once. So Google Nest accessibility features are also not necessarily as good, but that really depends, to be quite honest with you. So, for example, like the Google Nest displays, right? They actually have a built-in screen reader. I have tried to use it, and I don't really like using it. But also, Amazon's screen reader that they have as well is also not my favorite. I feel like it's actually better than the one that Google Nest has, but I am also not a fan of Amazon's screen reader either. So neither one of them is particularly good, but honestly, I never need to use it, because it's it's meant to be a voice assistant, so it's not too big of a deal, to be honest, to me. So obviously, accessibility support can also vary depending on the device, or if you're using like a third-party service. So again, just like with Alexa, it's worth keeping in mind if you're buying a device that has Google Assistant built in, it may not be as accessible or user-friendly for you, or if you're trying to use a third-party service, again, it might not actually be accessible. So I will say this does lack a lot of accessibility that Amazon does. So I mentioned like Alexa skills, for example. Google, as far as I'm aware, is completely lacking when it comes to things like that. So again, if you are interested in those sorts of things, like the Alexa skills, then Alexa might be the better option for you. I personally like Google Assistant more because I feel like it integrates better with the services I use. I don't really use any Amazon services. But if you use Amazon services and you are interested in some of the Alexa skills, then Alexa's totally a viable choice for sure. So that's actually going to be it for this episode here. We've learned a lot today about the different kind of software suites that people may be using and whether or not they are accessible, and also about accessibility on smartphones. So essentially the takeaway here is there isn't necessarily a better option for a lot of people. It really depends on what you're doing and what you're using. If you have any experience with like screen readers or any of these different softwares, definitely do share your thoughts or anything that you may or may not have encountered, or if you know of anything better actually than any of these, then please feel free to let us know. Definitely suggest any topics or anything that you want us to talk about in the future. We would love to kind of maybe help people out by covering topics that they aren't necessarily as aware of, or if we can maybe cover something that might help other people learn, then that would honestly be really great. That is going to be it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. It is great to be back, and I will be back again next week. As always, this has been the Envisiontech podcast. I've been your host, Paul Gagan, and I will see you all next week.